Stanford University.
Pleasure to be here. This is on. Today I'd like to talk about thinking with body and things. It's a topic that is of very current interest among many people, and I'll just dive right in by saying the basic thesis of this in its strongest form is that thought is a distributed activity. And what's interesting about this is that it involves tools essentially. And the weaker form, which is the way it's a little easier to justify, is that when we think, we harness material things for thought, including our bodies. That means our bodies are things we can think with. And the coupling is so tight that we might as well call that a form of thinking itself that recruits all these parts, and it's a coordinated system. I think the times are such that it's more or less unproblematic to say that we can understand how this might work when the things we're manipulating are external representations, such as words or language, sketches, visualizations, and models. But I'd like to argue that it's more than just embodied cognition. It's extended and distributed cognition. And here's how we can start with the word stuff first to soften you up on the words in case you don't already accept that. So Wittgenstein, and when he was writing the Investigations, which only came out in the very early 50s, wrote, "When I think in language, there aren't meanings going through my mind in addition to the verbal expressions. The language is itself the vehicle of thought." So vehicles of thought, which a phrase that goes back longer, much longer than Wittgenstein. Vehicle of thought, you have communication, sent in a vehicle of thought, explicitly, and Wittgenstein is arguing you can have thought vehicles inside the head, or possibly the external expression itself could be a thought vehicle. That raises the question whether it might be that anything that can be a thought vehicle, whatever its mode, explicitly and outside, could serve as, that is a communicative vehicle. Anything that could be a communicative vehicle could communicate a thought outside. Could that also serve as a thought vehicle, the vehicle in which you are using it to think in? So it's the medium in which the thinking is taking place, as opposed to just the external expression of that. So I think a view that is emerging in a kind of distributed way is that when we are engaged in thinking, and I grant you that the term thinking is an ill-defined term. People use it in different ways, and I'm not going to be proprietary or specific about how exactly to use it. But it points to a phenomenon we all kind of have a kindred feeling for. So there are lots of different processes in the brain or the mind, whatever you want to call that thing. And these form coalitions in various sorts of ways when one's engaged in some kind of cognitive activity like thought. What we're adding now is that when you're closely coupled to one of these other things, sketches or words or manipulables or even a violin, if you really attend closely to these external structures, they can wrap right in and operate with some of these things or together or in some complicated way, so that the whole distributed system now, we're talking about coalitions that don't respect the external surface of the body. So the coalition is the thing that's this activity of thought. So, for instance, I ask you, I'd like you to solve this problem. Can those pieces be assembled into this? I'll give you a few seconds to look at that. You're engaged in some kind of mental rotation activity, an assembly process. Your imagination is very active. Your projection abilities are very active. And the answer is no. There was a closed form solution if you counted the little bubbles and stuff. they wouldn't have evened out. But mostly no one, I expect very few of you tried an analytic solution. You tried a simulation of it to reassemble it. Okay. Now, solving it in the world is a more reliable way. Do you think that you were thinking when you were solving that problem? And if you had been assembling it, would you be thinking using the activity of assembling as part of the thinking process? It just loops a little bit out and captures that external stuff. So, you might ask, what extra do you get by going outside? So here we have this little idea. We take this and we parse the problem. I told you what the problem is. You convert that in some way into some kind of an intentional control. Psychologists historically have liked to call that executive control. It's a term now falling out of favor. But there's some kind of intentional control. There was maybe some motor simulation you weren't aware of. Certainly there was a lot of mental imagery going on. And what this was classically been thought to be what is in the head thinking. And now we want to know what extra do you get from, in this case, it should be manipulating those outside. It could have been writing on the paper, but this is about manipulating it. I didn't change the thing. So most of you agreed that it was some form of thinking. So here, again, that should say this could be writing, but it could be manipulating this. Why don't we call this whole thing a thought envelope or an envelope of thought? And this whole thing is something like a cognitive operating system, and the boundaries of the cognitive operating system vary depending upon what is being used and recruited from outside and brought into the system. Compare that process of manipulating those things with the little jigsaw pieces with some logical proof. You start with your axioms, you build your theorems and lemmas, and this is the discovery phase where you're writing them down. And then if the problem wasn't solved rapidly like that, it's going to take a few steps at it, then you reorder the theorems and lemmas to bring them somehow closer so that you can see relations between them. You don't have to flip between the pages and so on. So that process of bringing them closer is just like the assembly process. And what is it about? It's not creating external memory because they're already written down. You might call it computation, but it's a physical movement. Depending upon your theory of computation, physical movement may be a computation, but not in your first guess. But the right position increases the lemma visibility, so you get a chance to see relations better, and that certainly might seem to be a type of thinking. You're making thoughtful choices as you move it around, and I think the principle here is reshaping the metric of closeness. So here's what these are the lemmas that you came across, and this is somehow a distance in inference space, sort of how hard it was to get that lemma. A lot of stuff goes between. And then you take that, and this is sort of a distance. Maybe it was how many little things you thought of, or how long it took, or something. Some measure, and you could stretch and deform this by just now physically moving it around. So in physical space, you're bringing them closer. So the metric, the physical metric, of course, we can measure that easily. This one is harder to measure, but they have different metrics. So if we can just get it into this one, we'll be better off, probably, because things that we want to see are close together. And that's the principle. That's one principle. There's another power, again, related. So we ask, please make this multiplication, do this multiplication. And in the world after they built log tables, that great innovation, which people spent some time computing them for you, the cost of reducing that problem into this problem, which is just basically the log problem, log to the base 7, is going to be 9 plus 6. Then I look up log 715 to the value of that, and I get the answer straight back. So it's really easy to sum this in the logarithmic world, then look at the log table, and come back and get the answer here. The people who did all the work for us were the ones who made the log tables. So they're saving us all that effort. But if we can get it into this representation language, wow, that's a really great thing, and that's what the people thought in the 17th century, I think. So here we have this mapping relation, and if the cost of reduction, which is an activity, is low, we more than get the benefit of doing it. A very standard kind of idea of how benefits are accrued in the symbolic world. First, you have a complex geometric problem, so you try, or an algebraic problem, maybe map it into geometry, solve it there, map it back, standard kind of thing that goes on in math. And this gives us greater reach and more power, and it's more efficient. So let's take this as an idea. Cognition flows to wherever the costs are lowest. So we have this sort of in the head, and this is out of the head, and the processes and structures are going to migrate wherever the costs are smallest. And I don't care whether you call those operators representational or non-representational right now. That's not what's key. The key is this notion of basically flowing and following gradients of cost and stuff. That's fine, and I don't think it's startling or surprising. And we'd like to do better. So the next challenge is to find some metrics by which you can now cash this out more effectively. So how do we measure the cost of thinking interactively in the world versus just in the head? What would you use as the metric in here that you could compare with the metric out there? I showed you, I gestured at a metric because we were looking at the computational cost of doing them under different formalisms. And if that's what's happening inside, okay, but those are both outside things. Doing the multiplication outside with the bit within base 10 and doing the multiplication in the logarithmic sense. So those are all outside. Well, psychologists would proceed in a behavioral manner. And I'm okay with this for a while because we're looking at activities and behaviors. So the standard kind of way is to look at efficiency. And you could say, oh, well, how fast can you solve large multiplication problems using the logarithmic method? And how many errors do you make? And if I give you a different representational system or a different activity or different rules or different algorithm, tell me the speed accuracy. And it's better if it lies closer to the origin. Effectiveness, so that's efficiency. Effectiveness is how often do you reliably get to the right answer? It's not just are you doing it the right way, or how often are you getting there? So effectiveness is typically measured in terms of the variance. So are you hitting the right bullseye? Are you getting there? And you try out, again, your various methods of doing things. Robustness, well, if you make an error, how long does it take for you to discover the error and then fix it? That's another metric. Further metric would be how hard are the problems that you could solve like this? Do they have different scalability features? That would be something like computational complexity measures. But I think that since they're psychological, we also have these notions of these trade-offs, the probability versus time. Okay, so those are some course and behavioral measures. I wanted to introduce that so that we can, as a kind of background, so we can now proceed a little further in two things. One is just going over what I think is a core interactive strategy. I'll tell you about a little experiment we did. It doesn't solve your hard problems, but it's a fun experiment. Another one then is even more fun, which is a case study of dance, the creativity in dance, but the topic will be about this using bodies as things to think with. So if you ask now, why should you're asked to prove all three medians of a triangle always intersect at a single point. Why would you make a diagram? Some of you can solve this in your head, but there's a lot of state to keep, and you're moving along with all your little steps. You don't want to forget anything. So what does the diagram give you? Well, the key, I think looking at diagrams like this, it reveals a key interactive strategy, perhaps the key interactive strategy, which is, let's say we did create the figure. That's explicit. That's in the world. The next step before you actually do the rest of the things is so you remind yourself the problem. You're going to be taking these medians, and you want to prove the centroid, that there is a centroid, and that sort of thing. And so you say, okay, imagine you don't see those. Right. Maybe I'll draw a line like that. Now, as I do this with the pointer, you can see the line, right? What's that? It's not perception, because it's enduring. It's located. That's what I call projection, because it's augmenting the reality. So when we do the gestures and we do all these things, and I go like this, boom, you put the line in there. In fact, you saw me do it wrong. Let's do it from there to there. Okay. Now, how many of those can you do before you have the urge to write them in? And the interactive strategy is you try a little bit into the future, you see the future a little bit. Should I go that way? Should I go that way? Should I go that way? What would be happening? And then I actualize or create structure. So you project structure, you create structure. And people will go further or less far before they begin reaching for their creation, for the actualizing part. So I just mentioned what the difference. We can talk about the difference between projection and other things. Perception is sort of detecting what is where. The goal is to get it right, veridical. Projection, this is like the faint little thing that you put in there because you're augmenting the reality. And imagination is entertaining structure or process unconstrained by what's there now. I mean, not going into the psychology of imagination, but phenomenologically, imagination is meant to be free. You can put in what you want. A chimera, if you prefer, or a centaur. So we did a little experiment on projection experiment. And the experiment was this. We asked people to play tic-tac-toe without writing anything down. And so they learned these cells. And we were going to play it, so there's the subject and the experimenter. And the subject calls out his or her number, 1. And the experimenter replies, 5. And you play the game like that. Right? Straightforward game. And there were 3 conditions. A blank piece of paper, which we call the imagination condition, a table on the piece of paper, which we call the projection condition, and another projection condition, just in case there's some cost to keeping X and O there. If you feel you have to keep it in. I don't know how you fill it in. You can make it white and dark, or I don't know how you store your moves and their moves. But you have to store different moves, so there have to be at least something in there. And after people trained to criterion on this, they played the game with us. And the results in that game were surprising and disappointing, I might say, until you looked more closely. So the results were that basically projection didn't give you anything. You didn't need that external scaffold, if you want to think of it as a scaffold. You didn't get anything from it. We did have the presence of mind to bin our subjects according to whether they were good visualizers. They did a Vivic 2 test on vividness of visual imagery. And so we could tell who was good and less good at visual imagery. And we found, as you would expect, that the strong visualizers were faster. Lower is better. And the table condition, yeah, they seem to be doing a little better in the table condition. That's the scaffolded condition. Than blank, but it's not. None of this was significant at all. So imagination seems just as good, and even more interestingly, when we debriefed them, we asked them. They actually many of them preferred to play the game in their imagination than under the scaffolding condition by, a good measure. And why? So here's where it starts to get interesting, I think, because there's a cost to doing that augmented reality. You've got to anchor it in the right place. You can't just do it in your head. or they could have different methods by which they're drawing. I mean, but it seems that there seems to align the mental projection with the outside, there's some cost to that. That has to be proven, but that's a conjecture. So then we said, well, let's try 4 by 4. So in the 4 by 4 game, where you reach criterion on this, in fact, the table condition, the scaffolding condition, was faster, significantly faster for all subjects, not actually for the strong visualizers, so there's an interaction, and the weak visualizers quite a lot. The strong visualizers now are significantly better than the weak visualizers in performance. And so we have what you would expect. That is, if as the task starts to get harder, scaffolding the projection pays off. Well, what have we learned? We've learned at least that scaffolding does help. And we do see that people do kind of project. That's what it suggests, as opposed to imagine, that there is the presence of an effect from having the scaffolding there, better than imagination. And that in all probability, if you went to a 5 by 5, we should do that, then the strong visualizers too will bend over and accept this as a better way of life. So the implication, I think, is that there's only so far you can go in imagination before you need to interact. And the benefits which are negative at first for the little projection complexity, as the projection complexity gets harder, there's some kind of line here. I have no idea what it's shaped like, but there's some kind of line. So we're going to say then that the cognitive use of things, that is recruiting or absorbing or putting that scaffold into the envelope of thought, where you're actually augmenting the reality and using that, that's going to happen at some point. And what this cognitive use of things might consist in then is projecting and then reifying the projection or creating structure and pushing yourself on for the next stage of projection. Okay, now, I've argued so far that most of this is a matter of cost structure. And the processes will flow. Whether you pick up the pen to add the structure is really a matter of all of those behavioral measures, whether you'll be efficient or faster or more reliable. That's one measure. But the other measure, the sort of thing lurking underneath, is that it's easier. The cost is better. It's better, in some sense of better. We had trouble measuring cost other than those behavioral measures, but there could be other measures. I mean, you could go neural measures, perhaps. But another thing that is more than just cost is access to new operators. So, are there things you can do outside that you can't do inside? I grant you that minds and representational capacities are extremely flexible, and it's unwise to say what can't be done. But I'm confident that we do not get compliance inside our mind-brain. I'm confident that we do not get physical leverage inside our mind-brain or elasticity, body things. Confident. It just doesn't work that way. And it's not pulsing. It could be, but it's not. So, those are operators that if we could somehow harness those operators, they might do work for us. Maybe length, absolute length, like in a slide rule, could be harnessed in a way that we don't do that inside. You can't do that. So that would mean that if we could harness these in some way, we could maybe construct structures that we've never thought of. And by using those things outside, and of course the outside has the work of others, like the log tables, so that's going to be valuable. Periodically people introduce new kinds of concepts and operators and things that would never occurred to us. So that's going to be one possibility, one thing that I think we get from the outside. And another is that you can, by finding better ways of putting things outside, like large numbers, you can see those things and can deal with them when you couldn't inside your head. These external mechanisms that exist, like pocket calculators and so on, they allow us to bootstrap. give us new ways of manipulating. This is the kind of obvious stuff. So I think the obvious thing is that you ask whether one technology is better than another technology. You'd like to move to cost structure. You'd like to say, oh, well, look, people like to use pencil and paper until you give them a pocket calculator. Why is that? Because it's easier and faster and so on. All those behavioral measures. And then you say, oh, well, people like to use a pocket calculator until they can do this other thing, and then they find that that's a better thing to use, and then they just move to that. So that's a very standard adaptive model of people moving to where it's less costly to work on in something. Another measure is processing with greater precision or longer outside, so you can keep something running much longer outside than inside. And you could harness the world to simulate processes that you can't simulate internally or can't simulate well internally. For instance, some processes are best simulated by doing them. So there was that distinction that von Neumann introduced, that Marr picked up between type 1 and type 2 processes. A type 1 process might have those two upside down, but the distinction is between processes whose simplest description is themselves. That is, any representation is no simpler because there's so much random interaction between the elements that any effort at modeling that, any effort at modeling that is going to be just as complicated in bits as it is as the process itself. So now we look at yet another thing. Models. Models are great. We all love models. Here is the, this is not actually, I couldn't find this anywhere. I'd love to get this. If anyone knows about this, I'd like to have it, please. Watson, after the American physicist, chemical physicist, some of you might know him, physical chemist, came and said, you know, they didn't actually, you've been working with the wrong characterization of the structural relations of these compounds, of the bases, the amino acid bases. And so he corrected them, and Watson promptly put them into cardboard cutouts. And then they worked with the cardboard cutouts. Well, Watson worked with the cardboard cutouts on the table, and he saw that you could have all the combinations, and things worked out in ways that hadn't worked out before, and then called Crick over, and that's when they got very excited. And it was by playing with that cardboard cutout collection. If anyone can find a picture of those cardboard cutouts, that would really be nice. Anyway, these are not they, but people use models in all sorts of ways for valuable things, and when we get these representations, we can see things and have access to things we otherwise couldn't have. Edgerton's time lapse. And of course, in our architectural models, you can get hard to visualize angles. So the value of having things outside which transcend our own sensory capacities is apparent and obvious to everyone. But somehow we have to be recruiting those, bringing those in for thoughtful activity. Here's something I just learned very recently. There's another example of how doing things outside shapes the thinking process. So these are Paleolithic stones, and if you found one, you might wonder whether somebody did something to it or whether it happened to be nature, which just did that. And so do anthropologists or archaeologists sometimes. Now, how they resolve the issue is there turns out to be, among the illustrators, principles of lithic illustration. And there, you know, you don't show the fossils and you don't show certain other things on the rocks, so there's things you ignore. But more importantly, the napping process, using the sort of napping stone to break the pieces off the target stone, in a way, in order to illustrate it correctly, you have to show the places that were napped and the direction of napping. So you can recreate the stone, the napping process, by making the illustration. And all archaeologists find it much easier to look at this than those. These are the preferred way of presenting the stones, is in their illustration form. So what happened here? Here we've created this external structure, which is essentially, again, a kind of scaffold. It's a tissue. It's a thing that you're going to work on. And because of the principles of how you work on it, you're training the eye for expert vision to sort of look here, look here, look. Does that really have those lines? That process of training the eye gives rise to the solution to the problem of whether or not it was a napped stone or whether it was a naturally produced stone. So the hand is sort of training the eye in the sense of expert vision or professional vision, but it also might be entraining. So entraining is a term, I think of it informally as when you hit one tuning fork and you have another tuning fork, this one starts to resonate, and training in the human context is better, is most easily seen if I asked you to beat something in 4x4, unless you're a good musician, and I asked your friend to beat it in 5 against 4, that guy doing 5 against 4 is going to fall into 4x4 soon. He's going to get sucked in to that dominant way of beat. So that this difficulty people have. Are you doing 5 against 4 on 2 hands? That's good for you. That I can't. So that's entrainment. Now we could then see this kind of napping thing as a coordinated tool. That is, it's a tool that is orchestrating the visual processes or the attention processes to sequence what we look at, whose outcome is the answer. You get to see the right things to understand the problem and solve it. So this then becomes a kind of coordinating tool, a scaffold again. It's almost like the structure that's scaffolding the projection. So here's an upshot so far. Thinking with things can change the domain and range of cognition. I'm 100% confident that in 100 years, people will be able to entertain thoughts and think in processes which currently we cannot. And I know, you can imagine the fights that I will have had with mathematician friends who say, we aren't any smarter than the Greeks. So that's the challenge. Do you think that without jacking in a synthetic prosthesis into the brain, people are effectively getting prostheses from the environment? That's the question. Well, let's look a little further. So here's physical simulating. We're staying on this simulation for a second. It's a bizarre picture from the internet. Anyway, this little girl, no doubt with her sister, who they were playing a game. Do you think she learned something special about what it would be like to be a horse under the influence of reins by role-playing the part, and that she wouldn't have got that by sitting in her bed imagining it? So the question always that I'm trying to ask now is, what extra do you get beyond what you could do in your head, either through mental simulation or imagination or anything you want, by actually involving the body, not just like in twitching, but involving the body, or now involving other things? That's the question. I think she gets something special. And Peirce used to say, a chemist thinks as much with test tubes and hands as pen and pencil. Pen and paper, that should say pen and paper. So Peirce, a great American philosopher from the 19th century and early 20th century, polymath, mathematician, chemist, logician, father of semiotics, all that stuff. His view was, because he had such a rich notion of semiotics, of symbolism and of interpretation, he saw things, the next thing you were doing as interpreting the last thing. This thing became a sign or symbol or representation because of what happened as a form of interpreting. So he had no problem having this extend out into the world. Musical thinking. So I take this as a good example of what is the deepest claim in situated cognition. So the deepest claim in situated cognition is that being involved is essential to understanding, to acquiring the concepts in the activity. So here we have Jascha Heifetz, surely not engaged in linguistic or verbal concepts, but engaging either music or engaging sound, whatever it is you think the domain is that is being engaged here. And his engagement, mediated by the instrument, is different than our engagement as listeners. And that the user of the tool actually being there, situated in the fullness of the experience of creation, has access to a set of causal relations that give rise to some kind of conceptual understanding that is not easy to translate and is very much situated to the context. So that means that, there are these sort of not state-specific, but activity-specific concepts. And that's always been the problem of translation or learning something in one domain and hoping that it transfers to another domain. In this case, it's non-propositional. All right. That was the first half. Now I want to show you something that's got more eye candy in it and is a delight. This is thinking with the body. So it's really looking at the body used as a sketching tool. That's from a grade 4 child. Okay, so here's the case study. We had Wayne McGregor came to UCSD to see if he wanted to be the innovator in residence for a few weeks or a month or so at UCSD. He went around and talked to a lot of people, and we hit it off. I went then to London to see what he was doing, and I was amazed to see him in 2 hours produce with his company a wonderful piece of dance. I would have applauded, stood up and applauded. Anyway, we then agreed to work together, and he came to UCSD with 11 dancers, 10 from Random Dance, his troupe. He's the choreographer in residence for the Royal Ballet, but he also has a very contemporary group called Random Dance. And they came to UCSD, and we taped everything from the moment that the group heard that what the topic of the new dance was. We had 8 video cameras and 25 students taking notes, and they would be assigned each one to a dancer, so they'd like be Team On or Team Agnes and that sort of thing. Until the point of its performance in premiere in October 13th. So they came out for 3 weeks, and that was about 13 work days. And then I went to London, a few of us went to London, and there was another 12 days of making over there. They call it making. And then the premiere happened. They started out with 11 dancers, 10, and one brought in because he's got a really tremendous gift for innovation and creativity, but he has the wrong body to be in Wayne's group. And but he's a professional dancer in Germany. And then 2 of them left, and one got injured, so the final product was with 7 dancers. We had a setup. It doesn't matter very much, but we put all these high-definition video cameras around. We were originally hoping to do motion capture and then three-dimensional recovery from a lot of cameras, but that was with 11 dancers and too much occlusion, not a hope. This is one place, so the students would be sitting around watching, and it's, of course, what are you going to study? So many hours. Is it 5 hours? In the UCSD episode, it's 5 hours a day for 13 days, and it's 8 cameras. What are you going to do with it? But we did. I'll tell you in a sec what we found. And so that they were taking notes, so that would be easier to code the video afterward. We'd have at least times, and this would all be tied to the individual people, the dancers out there. And then at the end of the day, well, before and after I interviewed Wayne, I learned a little bit about dance that way. And the students, we worked really hard to figure out exactly what we were going to interview the dancers with. Now, our goal with the dancers at the end of each day was to get them to dance their answers. Now, I don't mean dance that like, mime or something. No, they're making dancerly decisions in solving certain choreographic problems. And so if they're going to work on a phrase for 60, they work between 55 and 65 minutes reliably each episode when they're working on a task, that it's going to go through some kind of trajectory of change. And they will have started out one way and they will later be a little bit different. So we would try to get them to explain what the problem was that made them change. And then we got to ask some other questions as well. So I think that it's natural to say we use our body, but we don't think literally with our body. It's our brains that do the thinking, and the body just is there to be a nice thing to have. And if you ask why, it's because the body's just a medium. It's passive. It doesn't contribute. It's like you're in charge, right? The body's not. And if you say that the body in motion is a thought vehicle, either or a communication vehicle, then you have the right to say, well, if it's a vehicle of thought or communication, what's the object of thought? What's the meaning? What is it? So I think those are the two problematic things. Now, I am not going to say that every time a dance performance happens, they're communicating thoughts. No. And that the dancers are thinking these things, which I don't think they are, while they're dancing. So it's not even a failure to communicate what they're thinking through their body movements, because that isn't the goal. However, there are, in virtue of our watching this process, 3 phenomena that jumped out us as good candidates for thinking with your body. This is a well-known thing called marking. We called something else riffing, and they called something sketching. And these are cases where they use their body in a representational way. Marking, in the simplest case, here's an Irish river dancer, and river dancers will sort of, river dancers don't move their arms. So they practice like this sometimes. They practice their moves. Might be the sequencing, might be the timing. They do this little thing. Okay, this is really small marking. And ballet dancers who usually have words, at least in the old days, for what they did before ballet became more contemporary, they'll do a pirouette like this, and so on. So those are very standard gestural icons or well understood images for things. And when you do this, it allows the dancer, however, to abstract from the full-out version to focus attention on some specific aspect of the full-out version, which, not this one really, but this one, this is somehow figuring in it. So it's a weak model or a simulation of some sort of the final thing. So if we think simulations could be figuring in thought, why wouldn't this be figuring in thought? And so, I hope this will. So this is an example. Actually, can you kill those ones? Thank you. Okay, so watch. Now, this is Hannes. This is the German one. So, clearly they're working, he's thinking. You can see he's working on something. He's not literally practicing, because to practice, you usually practice the very way you would do something. He's doing a kind of partial or aspectival thing, and he's focusing on certain things. And she was doing things too slowly, and she got off balance, so she went at the right speed. You sit out there and you see these people doing all this stuff, and what are they doing? But they're marking. And what we did was we looked to see the full product, and then we looked at the marked product. And then later in London, after we fixated on marking as an interesting phenomena, we brought the dancers in and we gave them, asked them interviews. We had them dance full out, and then we said, show us how you would mark this for different functions and stuff. So let's just think about it for 1 second. I will come back to this marking. I just want to show you these three phenomena at the top level. So the vehicle is some kind of body movement. And now the object, which before was the problem, right? What was the body supposed to do if it was if it was a thought vehicle? What was the object of thought? Well, the object of thought could be, if you're an extensionalist, the actual physical thing later. That is what I'm pointing to, representing by this, to myself or maybe to others. Or it could be an intentional object, which is, I can't quite do the other one perfectly yet, but this is the one in mind that I have when I'm doing this. It's the ideal object. I've got it in mind, but I haven't got it in body yet. Or it could be some aspect of body movement. And this is an interesting thing because it is the hallmark of thinking, and the hallmark of when somebody grasps or entertains a proposition is a referent plus an attribute. It's not just the thing. A thought does not consist in the X or the PX. It doesn't consist in the brick. It consists in that thing being a brick, that is, the brick being there, or it being a brick, or it consists in its texture, or there's some aspect, some attribute that is copulating with the referent, that is being to the referent. So aspects are very much the thing about thinking, even if you don't believe in propositional thinking as exclusively. Riffing, next little phenomenon. So to generate better, more interesting candidates, the choreographer relies on a collection of techniques for harnessing his sensory simulators. So here, the story we're really telling is, well, you get power by running something through one kind of simulation system, maybe a mental imagery system, and then you send it off to the motor system, and it has a different code, which makes some things explicit and some things less explicit, and you send it back to some other system. Just like you go from, algebra to geometry back to algebra or something. Only in this case, you're dealing with codes inside, and the body is doing something good for you. And so he would often look at people, and then he'd have to internalize it. I'm going to show you that now. So he would use these sensory changes and body movements as a tool for mental and physical sketching. So that's music. So what we would see was they'd be doing their thing, and then suddenly, and he might be watching, maybe not, and then he would get up occasionally, and suddenly he'd do his thing, and if they were watching him before, they stopped watching. He's just doing what he's doing, but he's absorbing it. And often another creative technique that he had, which I like a lot, which can be used for brainstorming as well, he would have somebody do a phrase, and then he'd have another person learn that phrase or use that phrase. What he would do is each body is different. So he'd basically take the signature phrase and he'd run it through another body and see what he gets. And then sometimes, there's little differences. He likes that better there. Or he'd take that now and use something from that, put it back in the first if he could. So it was a way of multiplying the creative possibilities, candidate generation. Here we're going to see him over here, his wing. And, okay, so now he's watching that. That's Hollow and Hang.
Because we do half of that, half so it's really the same.
Very international group, by the way. Everybody's from a different country.
If you do half of that and it's like...
So he did watch for a while, but he's no longer watching. There's just a lot more of that. So here's a case where we have the vehicle, either the body movement, or maybe it's just the motor program is the vehicle. Then that sensory code in there. It could be that he is doing something and the object is exactly that movement. That's exactly what he wants, that thing. Or it could be the ideal one. or it could be an aspect, as before, something he's figuring out, using this to figure out something, or it could be a feeling, because often the dancers were very much oriented toward having certain feelings when they were dancing. Not usually anger feelings, but some kind of expressive feeling. Sometimes the feeling would be a sort of effort feeling. I'm not sure it was always you're best understanding it as an emotion, but it has a visceral feeling. And he wanted them to keep that even to the performance, even after it's perfectly in motor memory. The third phenomenon, called sketching, they called it sketching, it's when you learn another's phrase. So these are fantastic dancers. Anything you could do, they could duplicate 1/2 second, a second or two behind you, exactly what you're doing. When they have to do that on a complex phrase themselves, they can't do that. They're close, but not quite. And so they're leaving out some details. They call that sketching. So here, Wayne was showing something to Paolo. So Paolo did that slower, more slowly. There, he did it faster now. Meanwhile, Odette, who was with a dancer of Wayne's for 12 years and now is the his assistant, she has a fantastic, prodigious memory. And she will remember all these. So she sketches everything is happening, and she remembers it at the end of the day, and they name it, they baptize this thing, and it's remarkable. It's interesting distributed memory, but she's great at that. Okay, so now let's look more closely at marking for the last few minutes. So here's what I think we could pictorially think of marking as. Here's the full-out phrase. Here's the marked phrase. It's got the key bits. The rest you can sort of, Or you could do it in tiny. Or you could stylize it, and the relationship is now much more complicated. Or you could even do small stylized. And it's a kind of sketching, but it's not always transparent to everyone else what the sketch means. Now, we found 3 kinds of marking. They could mark for themselves. That's the thing we want to study. So they're using their own body to encode an aspect of the phrase. They can mark for others, where they use their body so others can watch it. For instance, both Wayne and Odette would require that they couldn't have them dance 5 hours continuously, full out, after they've already done 2 hours of very sweaty warm-up. It's just too much every day. So they would allow them to mark certain things. But they had high norms for this kind of marking for them. And the high norms were that they had to show the full end points of it. They didn't have to get the dynamics right, but they had to do the full size. And if they're marking at the end for the lighting crew, where you have to know shadows and how it's going to play against the scenery, the set, everybody had to mark full like that. There were conventions for this. Joint marking is where 2 or more dancers run through. They might be for grips or timing. Here's an example then of marking for others.
Yeah, so as she goes down, sweetie, brilliant.
So the words are interleaved here, but there's a real physical dialogue going on here. Now Antoine in the back is doing that.
Stop! Good. So good. So you feel your attitude. You feel your attitude, you might see finish it. So this is really clear. Yeah. You need to kind of time it, some other pair of you, so after you finish, Max is the one that will take you back. Yeah, he'll shift you in that direction.
All right, I'm just going to proceed. We're almost done, but there's a few more things for you to see. Here's marking for coordination. All right. exactly he's riffing or whether he's imitating, but I think he's working on grips and joints and relations there. Okay. So here's marking for self. So this is part of the interviews. We had, say, each one of them come out and we say, okay, dance this in full, please. So here's his phrase. They're better in costume with the whole group together and context, but they're interesting body movements. In fact, one of his objectives, or at least here he's going to mark it large, so he's going to give us so you'll notice that he's covering a lot of the space, but not completely, and something's going on in there, right? Yeah.
How come you made the sounds now when you marked it? You didn't make sounds before when you did it for real.
Absolutely. The details are missing. Here's... So you can see how tiny now. He's just small marking. And they would do mental simulation sometimes in the tube going home or in bed, but they came to work and they would, do a lot of this marking.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah.
Full.
That was full, yes.
And the marking it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
full
6.
space.
I'm not using energy, but I'm thinking what's my pathway.
Okay. And so she's thinking about exactly, she's a ballet background, very strong.
This is the smallest one.
Okay, so now she's just thinking, see, this is the smallest one you can do. All right, so we're coming to the upshot now. So when they're marking for others and for coordination, it's a kind of 3D notation system. There's no reason why we can't have notation systems in 3 or 4 dimensions, and I think it is. In that sense, you could ask, is it a language? Well, the one reason to think it's not a language is that in a language, if I say the bottle is on the desk, you don't have to have seen the bottle being on the desk to know what it means to say the bottle is on the desk. But it turns out that in marking, you can't really know what the target phrase is from the marking unless you've seen the target phrase. You have an idea, but you don't have a good enough idea. It depends what need the idea serves. So it's kind of semi-private. Now, it's not just an anything, because it turns out that this is how I see it. So this is the kind of René Thom thing. So, René Thom, sorry, not René Thom. Turn of the century, growth and form. Darcy Thompson. Darcy Thompson. René Thom took Darcy Thompson's stuff. Darcy Thompson, whom I believe had seen Klein's Erlangen program. I'll show you in a second. So he was interested in how these distortions in a standardized manner could explain substantial variation in form without there being necessarily a genetic underpinning. It could just be that you, not like this, but like you fed them a little bit here, then you fed them a whole lot, and then you fed them a little bit, only not like that there, right? So that would be an explanation for why this thing got warped, the metric got warped. And Klein, in his Erlangen program before, had tried to identify the primary functions, geometric functions. And what we did was we took these functions and we could show how all the marking would be one or another of these functions. Could be expressed as a function. So it's kind of like a similarity, a definition of the similarity relationship, but under a distortion. And but only the marker. So there is a sense in which there's a semantic rule. If I know which one it is, I know what the answer is. But if I don't know which one it is, I don't know what the answer is. So only the dancer knew which transform they were using usually. But if you had seen it, then an expert could easily see which transform they were using. Marking also has a combinatorics. You can add or repeat especially or delete bits. And it's essentially using the body to simulate the body. And what's special about it is it anchors projection. So now you're using the body. So now here's the little account from before. You're using the body now in the same way that the X and O thing was being used, or the figure thing was being used, where you're drawing, you project a little bit, and then you have to anchor it on something, and then you can project some more, and you provide more that you can anchor it on. So it's a way of anchoring that projection, helps manage attention, recruits the body to fill in timing. So the body, so you don't have to, suppose I'm thinking here and here, I don't have to compute this if my body is going to do it, because that's what the body does. So I get the in-between for free. So that's a powerful thing. And it allows them to focus on specific aspects. So here's the general line. Always ask, what extra does a physical give you beyond what you can do in the head alone? Why would you simulate it? Why would you run it through the body for real? And one of the key points is that we're really translating between systems. So we might have a mental image, convert it to physical movement, reinterpret it, or musical notation, play it on the piano, renotate it, now play it on the violin, get something different by transforming it like that. Each medium would teach us something. What's obvious in one might not be obvious in another, and vice versa. We get this kind of interactive process because it's out there, so we can focus on what we're going to be doing. So we get this interactive projection again, and it increases the scope and power of cognition. So here was the group when we were at UCSD, and most of the dancers are there too. There, a little too close there. Maybe not all the dancers. Paolo, yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. Please, yeah.
In the tic-tac-toe experiment,
Yeah.
Is it possible that one of the contributing factors to the difference that was seen was that the 3x3 game is much more familiar than the 4x4 game?
Could be. It could be, but I mean, we still saw the regularities to do with how fast the different people played. And I mean, the general shape was pretty similar. Well, certainly we'll know by going to 5, wouldn't we?
Well, perhaps.
But I think people can generalize just fine, really.
Well, because I was just thinking about it in my head. I was imagining 4x4 and it's just, I don't know, like a weird...
It's harder.
This is weird.
It also goes back to like Simon's thing on patterns. I know all the patterns of the 3x3.
Yeah.
I don't know any of the patterns of the 4x4, so I'm going to have a different kind of relationship to it.
Maybe it could be overrun like that, sure. But they're still pretty. You're not trying to get 3 on 4, so there's still going to be just dun 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 dun. It's not. You just got a few extra ones, but I grant you, and it doesn't convert to the game of 15. So.
I have 2 questions. One, are the words riffing, sketching, and marking their words that you picked up on?
Marking is a term that practically all dancers learn. My little daughter learned it in ballet class. However, I had a search done at the Allowable Institute, and there is no published work on marking, at least that they could find. And I also used our library to try to look for some. I've had a lot of trouble finding anything on marking. But it's a term of art. It's a practice universally done, and I just want to say, when a cellist does this, or when we run through a lecture in a hurry, that's all marking. It's the same. It's an extremely general process by which.
Wedding rehearsal.
Any kind of like superficial rehearsal of the event is a marking. Sketching, Sorry, they have a term sketching specific to them, not other troops maybe use it. That refers to this quick learning from somebody else, and riffing was a term that I used to characterize that.
The second question is, when you're doing the kind of marking, like a joint marking or coordinated,
Yep.
if you don't know what the thing you're referring to is, like you're trying to find it out, you're improvising, or you don't have the object on the table.
So the marking, this is the thing about marking. You have to know the object. You may not be perfect at it, but you have to have a clear idea of what the target is. So it is not an improvisational thing. At least as they used it, and it seems to us to be a regularity in the process.
So the type of projection that you're talking about when they do marking is for variations or slight changes within a target.
Or coordinate, in the case of coordination, I think I know what it is, you think you know what it is, so there's this working out, and it doesn't have to be at full speed to work out those like structures, because they're instantaneous structures, and then you could have them in time, working out like that. Yep.
Hey, David.
You're welcome.
I get a little lost when you're talking. I'd like to know more clearly when you're talking about normative accounts of cognitive distribution and when you're talking about more descriptive or naturalistic accounts of cognitive distribution. You have sort of an ecology, right, as a landscape. You're saying, well, regardless of metabolic barriers, computation is going to flow wherever it's going to flow and gain the most, return on investment, right? But sometimes it seems like you're saying, if so-and-so does this, they'll get these returns. Sometimes you're saying, when you observe someone with this kind of ecology, we will see that. Regardless of what the person happens to be thinking about return on investment, the computation is going to go inside the head, it's going to go outside the head. I'm trying to understand this. Part of the issue is recruitment and use, right? When does a person, thinking about, like when you take the GRE, and now it's on the computer, something that changes how you think about the way you're going to use sketching, right? Because you can't just mark up your test booklet. You're thinking, well, I'm going to use an annotation to help me compute. Now that involves copying down the diagram. Well, that changes the computational profile, right? How much of it is just describing where cognition is going to go, regardless? How much of it is sort of talking about tools that people can use to be situated?
All right. So let me restate that again a little bit in the way that I would like to. We don't always know when we're thinking. I mean, we like to think that we're in intentional control of our thought, but as I speak right now, the words are trickling out without my prior grasp of where they're going. Roughly. I don't really know where they're going. And as I'm going along, I'm laying down the tracks. So, okay, it's under intentional control, but I am doing the best I can to put the pieces together. Now, if it turns out that there's something that would avail itself to me, I may reach for that. I look here, I see, can I use this as an artifact to make a point in my communicative context? Yes, I did have that intention somewhat, but it's happening so fast that I think we'd be hard pressed to say when the process is flowing that way and I'm the beneficiary of the process flowing that way, and when I'm really driving it that way and I know I'm making a turn over there. So I think that it is a far more fluid, dynamic process than is easy to account for by kind of a planful way. And I took you to be talking about a planful way, or there being norms for it.
David, you have to cut it here. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.